Welcome to Chapter 3, Episode 2, North and South. Last episode, we were introduced to the Renaissance and looked specifically at some music by Guillaume Dufay, the first proponent of what became known as the Franco-Flemish school. This episode, we will look at Antoine Bernois and Johannes Ockeghem, while we also explore the question of a Northern and Southern Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance is often considered as the earliest form of the Renaissance, and Italy had a huge influence on European arts and culture going forward, partially because of the powerful textile and banking industries, artistic patronage, and the competition between courts for this media. At the same time, important developments were taking shape in France, Flanders, and England. It's interesting to look at the connections between North and South and how they shaped artistic expression and tastes going forward.
In our last episode, we considered how the Italian peninsula, with smaller competing states, wealth, trade routes, and richness in ancient manuscripts and ruins, was primed to initiate the Renaissance in Europe. And we looked at how some of those changes took shape in Italy in the first couple decades after the year 1400. If we look at a map of Europe in the 15th century, we can see how banking and shipping routes connected European cities and facilitated not only the flow of wealth and commerce, but of ideas. Just as trade and banking in Venice, Genoa, and Florence helped power a Renaissance in the south, the commercial success of Dijon, Paris, Bruges, Brussels, Ghent, and Antwerp spurred a distinct transformation in the north. When we speak of Franco-Flemish, we're using a kind of shorthand to discuss the complex historical, political, and cultural relationships between the Kingdom of France, the Burgundian court centered in Dijon, and the wealthy cities of the lowlands. In the travel writing of Pero Tafur, we have a fascinating 15th century account of this northern affluence. Tafur, a nobleman from Castile, undertook an epic tour of Europe and the Mediterranean in the 1430s, passing through Genoa, Venice, Florence and Rome, through the Greek islands, the Holy Lands, Egypt, and Constantinople, and ultimately crossing the Alps and passing through Germany to reach the Low Countries in 1438. Bruges, he thought, was one of the greatest markets in the world, and he witnessed greater commercial activity there than in Venice, since, he said, in Bruges, all the nations of the world could be found engaging in trade. Tafur was particularly astounded by the range and quality of the produce. He noted that anyone who has the money and wishes to spend it will find in the town alone everything which the whole world produces. Antwerp, Bruges' rival as the commercial center of Europe, left him lost for words. I do not know how to describe so great a fair as this. I have seen others at Geneva in Savoy, at Frankfurt in Germany, and at Medina in Castile, but all these together could not be compared to Antwerp. To begin to understand the contrasts between a Renaissance in the north and south, let's compare a few visual masterpieces from both geographies in the 15th century. Between 1412 and 1416, the very wealthy patron, collector, and bibliophile, John, Duke of Berry, commissioned the Limbourg brothers to create what is now known as the Très riche œuvre du Duc de Berry. The patron and both artists died in 1416, presumably of the plague, and the work was ultimately completed by other artists, but no expense was spared, and the artists had the best inks and materials to fashion this luxurious book, a late example of the international Gothic style. Among the miniatures are the elegant calendar scenes depicting peasants and aristocrats throughout the seasons, against backdrops of beautiful medieval architecture. Though created when Ghiberti and Brunelleschi were innovating in Florence, these images seem to capture in beautiful artistry something of the spirit of the Middle Ages. In contrast to these exquisite miniatures, we could return to Florence in the 1420s to appreciate the elegant frescoes that decorate Brancacci Chapel. The Brancacci family commissioned master painter Masolino da Panciale to paint the chapel, but when Masolino left to take on work for the King of Hungary, The commission fell to Masolino's apprentice, 18 years his junior, the 21-year-old Masaccio. In this chapel, we see the hands of both of these masters, and we can experience the use of perspective, unified lighting, chiaroscuro, and naturalistic figures that many scholars identify as elements of an emerging Renaissance style. In the 1430s, the Medici family came to power in Florence, transforming Florence from a republic effectively into a principate, and ruling Florence for 3 generations until 1494. The great banking wealth of the Medici supported a great blossoming of the arts in Florence for the rest of the century, and Benozzo Gozzoli's 1459 fresco in the Magi Chapel offers a fascinating portrait of the Medici rulers. The work is a sacred story, the journey of the Magi, and is thought to be modeled on the earlier depiction of the story by Gentile da Fabriano, a true masterpiece of the international Gothic style now kept in the Uffizi galleries in Florence. Both works invite lingering attention to detailed, exquisite craftsmanship, and together they make for a fascinating study of style, technique, and influence. Gozzoli's work tells the story of the Magi with modern costume and courtly elegance, with many contemporary portraits. Among these are portraits of the Medici family, including this idealized portrait of the young Lorenzo il Magnifico. The epic work rewards careful study and seems at once to express a nostalgia for the past, to project political power, and to employ traditional religious forms in celebrating real individuals of the contemporary world. Finally, we turn to the Arnold Feni portrait by John van Eyck, painted in oil in 1434, right around the time the Medici family came to power in Florence. In a very direct way, this work illustrates the connections between North and South, depicting the Italian merchant Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, presumably in their private residence in the Flemish city of Bruges. Along with Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, this is one of the earliest paintings in oil and is considered one of the most original and complex paintings of Western art. Its masterful illusionism, exquisite details, innovative technique, and play of light bring the viewer into a realistic, intimate interior in a way that gives us a beautiful and profound look into the everyday life of 15th century life in Northern Europe. Our brief consideration of these works can only give a glimpse into the complex relationship between the Renaissance in North and South, and we hope it will inspire you to learn more. Our program booklet, linked in the comments below, offers some tools for digging deeper on your own. Let us know in the comments below what these or other artworks can teach us about the relationship between North and South in 15th century Europe. From innovative vision to sumptuous traditions, from manuscript miniatures to the monumental, from sacred to secular, from political to private, we hope these works help illustrate the diversity of expression and the complex cultural changes occurring both in North and South, as well as the rich exchange of ideas that shaped thinking in the arts as Europe evolved throughout the 15th century.
After the death of Guillaume Dufay, Antoine Bernois takes the place of being the leading composer of the Franco-Flemish school. Bernois was born in 1430 and died in 1492. He was an accomplished composer of church music, but also celebrated as a masterful composer of French chansons. Very little is known about his education, but he must have been trained as a boy chorister, and it's quite possible he even attended university. He held positions at Tours Cathedral and the Collegiate Church of Saint-Martin in Tours, where Johannes Ockeghem was treasurer. The two must have worked closely together. Later, Bernois worked for the Burgundian court. Curious fact, while a chaplain at Tours Cathedral, Bernois and a gang of other men mercilessly beat another priest, not once, but 5 times. Bernois was placed in a state of anathema and denied the sacraments, yet he defiantly celebrated Mass anyway, an act which got him fully excommunicated. Pope Pius II later pardoned him. Bernois' chanson was preserved in a small group of manuscripts from the Loire Valley. The poem is a virelai, one of the formes fixes that was revived by the 15th century poets in France. Ja que lit ne s'y attende, gives a view into the world of French-speaking courts of the 15th century.
Bernois' Jacqueline piece from the mid-16th century, another composer associated with the French royal court and with Burgundy, where these musicians' works circulated, speaks in a similar kind of a way. This is an effete music that is for select listeners. You had to be in the know to understand the architecture of Dufay's ceremonial piece. You had to be in the know to understand, in the case of Bernois' piece, the fact that there's actually a name of a royal princess that's spelled out by the words of the text itself. Complicated insider knowledge that's not necessarily audible, but is knowable. And that suggests a musical world in which the musicians are writing for each other and for a small coterie, perhaps, of literati or officials who provide them with the texts, who know which texts are to be set. And indeed, we have some documentary evidence, in fact, from the Medici in Florence, that tell us about the circulation of poetry and music, and that they are often sending musicians particular poems to be set. A kind of epistolary trade in music and in texts along the way.
There are two main sections to Jacqueline s'y attende, a stable A section and a more tentative B section that is typical for Bernois and his contemporaries when composing for a virelai. The B section consists of a set of couplets which Bernois underscores with certain musical gestures. Each ending for the B section points out the rhyme while also leading to a closing figure that echoes the cadence of the A section. Let's listen to Jacqueline s'y attende, sung by Orna Arania, accompanied by two viels. Johannes, or Jean Ockeghem, is a second generation of Franco-Flemish composer. He is the second of the big three of the Franco-Flemish school, Dufay being the first and Josquin d'Après being the third. Details of Ockeghem's early life are hard to come by. In fact, speculation on his birth year ranges from 1410 to 1430. He worked mostly for the French royal court and was well known not just as a composer, but also as an excellent bass singer and choir master. He knew Antoine Bernois from their time together at the collegiate church Saint-Martin in Tours. We are going to listen to the Sanctus from Ockeghem's Missa prolationum. The Missa prolationum has an extraordinary contrapuntal design. It consists entirely of prolation canons. Ockeghem uses all of Philippe de Vitry's prolations, that is, the measurement of time as developed in menstrual notation, which itself was a principal achievement of the Ars Nova, as you will recall from Chapter 2. In plainer English, each vocal part is in a different time signature. Not only that, but the same melody is spun out at different speeds by different voices. So, for instance, the soprano and tenor could be looking at the exact same line of music, but because they are assigned different prolations, the rhythms and lengths of notes must be interpreted differently. Dr. Friedman explains this very clearly and eloquently for us in an online conversation I had with him.
The same kind of story can be told through Ockeghem's Missa prolationum. This is a piece that's a kind of end point of a great legacy of organizing musical time through the very stuff of notation. So there's an important system that's called the Menstrual system of musical notation, invented in the late 13th and throughout the 14th centuries, that we are the heirs to in our complicated systems of time signatures and symbols and circulating levels of duple and triple division of time in a very complicated clockwork of hierarchical levels, slow-moving lower parts, fast-moving higher parts, each with their own kind of temporality and their own way of fitting within a mechanism. Here in the Missa prolationum, Ockeghem does a kind of a tour de force in which he exploits something that's hard for modern-day musicians to understand, but which was part and parcel of what happened in the 15th century, and that is the very same shapes that you would write down that look like our whole notes and half notes and quarter notes. The very same shapes would have surprisingly different meanings depending on which time signature you put in front of them. They could move at twice the speed or half the speed. That's not so bad. That's kind of like a tempo marking. But depending on which sign you put in front of them, the notes would have radically different meaning. And so what Ockeghem does is actually notates a part once and parks 2 or 3 mensuration signs in front of it. That's the prolation. Prolation is one of these levels of time. There's tempus and prolation and mode. These are sort of hierarchical levels of musical time. And the prolation mass is one that exploits the capacity of the same signs to be read in completely different meters simultaneously. And so he's able to write something down once, put several signs in front of it, and have the musicians create what sounds like a wonderful surface out of what's a very complex and sort of artificial graphical game. It would be like a puzzle piece in which you could derive a poem from one line of text. Something like that. And that is the great legacy of this kind of musical notation and musical space being the thing that, how do we want to put it? It's the technology that drives the music. You can't sing what you can't write down, maybe is the way to put this.
The Sanctus actually has 2 prolation canons going on. The 2 melodies are presented simultaneously at the beginning by the tenor, the second highest line, and bass, the lowest line. Then the soprano and contratenor enter, the soprano taking up the tenor line, but up the interval of a sixth, and the contratenor taking up the bass, also up a sixth, while the tenor and bass continue. Then for the Pleni sunt celi section of the Sanctus, we have a single prolation canon at the interval of the seventh. And for the Hosanna, back to a double prolation canon, now at the interval of an octave. Think about what an extraordinary mathematical feat this is. Time and space are stretched in miraculous ways, not by writing it all out, but embedding it in just one or two lines of music that essentially receive different directions for how to read them. Let's listen to the Sanctus of Johannes Ockeghem's Missa prolationum, one of the Renaissance's great contrapuntal masterpieces. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this music is not really the technical, demanding contrapuntal design, but the fact that it all comes together so mellifluously. In this episode, we looked at Antoine Bernois and Johannes Ockeghem, while we also explored the distinct societies of Northern and Southern Europe in the early Renaissance. Do you have any thoughts on what distinguishes the Renaissance in Italy from that of Northern Europe? Do you have any favorite artworks or musical works that help illustrate the comparison? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Join us next time as we turn our attention to the great Josquin de Prez, considered by many to be the composer who brings the Franco-Flemish style to its culmination. Martin Luther, the German church reformer, said of Josquin, "He is the master of the notes. They must do as he wills. As for the other composers, they have to do as the notes will." See you soon.